Dr. Uma Ramachandran is a doctorate in ecology and environmental sciences with 22 years of diverse work experience that include technical assistance and coordination of various projects related to environment and biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, environmental impact assessment, socio-economic studies, and poverty reduction. She is engaged with German International Cooperation Climate Change Project at the Department of Environment, Government of Tamil Nadu. She has served as ENVIS Coordinator at Environment Protection Training Research Institute, Senior Scientist at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, in addition to being faculty for PG course on Preventive Environment Management, University of Hyderabad, and guest faculty at Anna University, Chennai. She is trained in various field-oriented techniques. She has been a resource person in several training programs. She has published many articles in national and international journals, newsletters, edited books, and proceedings.
Dear students, welcome to the UGC lecture series on environmental sciences. So, we are continuing again with this biodiversity concepts and conservation topic, and we move on to the next portion, which will deal with why should we actually conserve biodiversity. And we are going to look at something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Okay, how this initiative happened and what are the different findings of this Millennium Ecosystem Development. Why should we actually conserve biodiversity? We know that there are lots of changes that are happening globally, and there is a lot of loss of biodiversity. There are many factors that are contributing to this loss of biodiversity. And one most important or the crucial aspect is the change in climate. So, because of this change in climate, there is a global increase in temperature, and there is also a lot of associated changes along with the increase in temperature. For instance, melting of the polar ice caps. Then you have the increase in sea level rise. On one hand, you have this kind of changes happening. On the other hand, if you look at the terrestrial ecosystems, we find that all these changes are also happening and affecting the different species in the terrestrial ecosystem as well as the aquatic ecosystem. We find that the species are reducing drastically. So, there is loss of biodiversity. Okay, and therefore, many have agreed that this climate change is one of the greatest threats facing the planet. So, recent years actually are showing trends in the increase in temperature in various regions, and also a lot of changes in the weather patterns, rainfall pattern, that is the precipitation and so on. Okay, so now we look at some of the major activities which are causing and posing a lot of threat to biodiversity, which we have looked at to an extent in the earlier series of the lecture. So, what is happening is massive extinctions are happening due to a lot of these human activities. Then there is decline in amphibian populations. There are lots of these fish stocks that are all reducing. Then loss of forests, okay, and to a loss, and these loss of forest ecosystems or degradation of forest ecosystems are also leading to loss of lot of these species or biodiversity that is existing in within the forest ecosystems. Then a lot of misuse of land resources, that is the resources are not utilized in a proper manner. They are being utilized for many other purposes which will actually harm the biodiversity. Then long-term costs, attempts also to promote biodiversity outweighed by activities against it, which means that we are trying to get more benefits from the biodiversity, but we are not replacing the biodiversity to the extent that we are actually using. So, that there is a gap between the use and the replacement of the biodiversity. Now, if you look at this figure, this graph, it shows like if you remember, we have looked at the different ecological pyramids where we looked the productivity and so on, how it increases from the base to the tip of the pyramid. So the producers are more at the base, and they are more in number, and like at each trophic level is being maintained if the ecosystem is in a balance. But if there is a mismatch, then there is a chance of decrease in the species or decline in the species at each of these trophic levels. So here this picture is exactly showing you this decrease, for instance in the fish stocks. Then this graph is actually showing you the species density. This is a comparison between the year 1960 and 1990, 3 decades. So this is showing the changes in the number of species found on a standard long line between these 2 years. So how there is loss and reduction of the number of species. And there is something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Now it is globally very well known that lot of biodiversity is declining. Everybody is talking about loss of species, extinction of species, and so on. But these need to be authenticated. So there are lots of global initiatives that are happening in the country, and also where India is part of it, and also globally many countries are involved in making lots of assessments, looking at how much, because you need to quantify as to what is the extent of loss and so on. So there is this initiative called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Initiative. This started sometime in March 2005. The report was prepared, and this actually highlights substantial and large irreversible loss in the diversity of life on Earth, with about 10 to 30% of the mammal, bird and amphibian species that is threatening to be extinct due to lot of human actions. So therefore, we find that this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is not looking at one particular species, it is looking at the global level, looking at all the biodiversity that is existing in the globe, and seeing what are the changes that are occurring, how much loss has happened for all the species put together, and where do we stand today. So why this assessment is important? Because it will form the baseline to actually take this forward to bring about proper conservation measures for conserving the biodiversity. So next is the Worldwide Fund for Nature. This has added to this saying that Earth is unable to keep up in the struggle to regenerate from the demands we place on it. So just now I spoke to you about the gap that is existing between the usage of resources and the replacement. Most of these resources are from the natural capital or the biodiversity. So we are utilizing biodiversity to such an extent, or we are reducing the biodiversity to such an extent that we are unable to replace it. We don't replace it, so that this mismatch is actually causing this problem, and that is why it has been talked of at the global level. So next is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. This has made a list of statistics of all the species that are existing on the earth. Where do we stand in terms of different intensities of threat? So for instance, threat of extinction are 1 out of 8 birds. So 1 out of 8 birds are going to be extinct, and 1 out of 4 mammals are becoming extinct, 1 out of 4 coniferous species are extinct, and so on. So these are all the different species that have been listed by the IUCN. And when we look at this, 75% of genetic diversity of agricultural crops has been lost, and 75% of the world's fisheries are fully or overexploited. Then up to 70% of the world's known species, they are under the risk of extinction in the global temperature rise by more than about 3.5 degrees centigrade, which is very significant. And 1/3 of the reef building corals around the world are threatened with extinction, and over 350 million people are suffering from severe water scarcity. So you can imagine the kind of threat that is being posed by this kind of loss. So 75% of genetic diversity of agricultural crops, that means the farming community are going to suffer to a large extent because of loss of the genetic resources associated with their crop plants. Then similarly, if you take fisheries, for instance, if there is a dwindling or a very diminishing trend that is being shown here, if there is a diminishing trend of these fishes, then the fishermen are going to suffer because the catch will reduce, the number of species available per catch will also decrease, and therefore it is which is actually the basis of their livelihood. Okay, so now this, how does this assessment actually happen? We need to also understand how many people are involved in this, how the assessment is being done, and so on and so forth. So experts and review process. So this is prepared by about 1360 experts from 95 countries, then 80% independent board of review editors, then review comments from 850 experts and governments, and in addition to global assessment includes information from 33 sub-global assessments. Then what is the kind of governance is that it is called for by the UN Secretary General in 2000, and this actually is authorized by governments through 4 conventions and partnership of all the UN agencies, conventions, business, non-governmental organizations with a multi-stakeholder board of directors. So this is the system of governance in this actually entire ecosystem assessment process. So many people are involved in this assessment at the global level and experts from different areas. Now focus, when we look at the ecosystem services, if you look at this flow chart, this shows the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. Now there are several ecosystem services. Even in the lecture 4 we looked at many of these services listed, and if you actually classify the ecosystem services, you find that there are supporting services, provisioning services, regulating and cultural services, and this basically shows the link between the ecosystem supporting services with the provisioning, regulating and the cultural services. For instance, nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, these are all the supporting services, and provisioning is food, fresh water, wood and fiber and so on. So you have these different types, and cultural, if you take, you have aesthetic, spiritual, educational, recreational, these are all classified under the cultural ecosystem services. And this next picture actually shows the consequences of ecosystem change for human well-being. So as and when these ecosystems are changing, what is the kind of or level of human well-being? So there is a link that is shown between ecosystem services on the left and constituents of well-being on the right. And you find these several arrows from left to right, and they are differently colored, and also the width is differing. That is because, for instance, light color and thin line actually represents that there is less potential for mediation by socioeconomic factors, and also that the linkage is weak. So we will just pick up a few examples. You take cultural. We looked at the different kinds of values of biodiversity in lecture 3, where I have talked about these different values, including aesthetic values and so on, because aesthetic value is something which is an abstract. I mean, you can only feel it. So it is something like it appeals to the eye. So for instance, a good patch of greenery just appeals to the eye a lot, so we tend to go to such calm green areas for recreation and for kind of if you want to take off from work or so. So this aesthetic value, if you look at this picture, aesthetic value, there is a thin line which is going to the basic material for good life, where these things I have listed, like adequate livelihoods, sufficient good shelter, access to goods. Okay, so here we are looking at, for instance, the cultural, aesthetic value, spiritual, educational and so on. There is a thin line which is light colored also, where the linkage is less and the potential for mediation by socioeconomic factors is also low. So, this is how we need to look at this diagram and understand the complex interconnectedness between the consequence of ecosystem change and the human well-being. So, we go for a short break and come back to it. Welcome back after the break. So, we are continuing with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment findings. Now, one thing is we looked at the assessment part. Now, what exactly are the findings is what we are going to look at. In this particular lecture, we are going to cover two important findings and we will continue with the rest in the next lecture. So, here the four main findings actually are ecosystem changes in last 50 years, gains and losses from ecosystem change. So, three major problems will decrease long-term benefits, and they are degradation of ecosystem services, increased likelihood of non-linear changes, exacerbation of poverty for some people. Okay, third and fourth we are not going to look at detail in this particular lecture. So, we move to the finding number 1. Over the past 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly and extensively than in any comparable period of time in the human history. So, it is the 5 decades which has contributed to the most, last 5 decades which have contributed to the most of the ecosystem changes that has happened. So, this has also resulted in a very substantial, irreversible loss of diversity. That means where we have extracted so much of these biodiversity and made use of it so much and destroyed it so much that, you know, it is largely contributing to the loss of this biodiversity on the earth. So, if we look at the details, here we look at the unprecedented change ecosystems. More land was converted to cropland. So, a lot of land was there, forest lands for instance. How the trend is happening is that the forests are getting converted into agricultural lands. The agricultural lands in turn are being converted for other land use purposes, urbanization, or you have these multi-storied buildings and industries and so on which are taking up. So, there is lot of rapid change in the land use pattern which is actually being mentioned in this point where it is converted to cropland. So, in the last 5 decades this has happened and this has contributed more to the percentage of loss, and 25% of the world's coral reefs badly degraded or destroyed in the last several decades. Then 35% of mangrove area has also been lost in the time. Amount of water in reservoirs is quadrupled since 1960, and withdrawals from rivers and lakes, this has doubled since 1960. And if you look at other kind of changes, this is talking about the biogeochemical cycles. Now, when you look at the ecosystem, apart from several other cycles, you have the biogeochemical cycles, that is cycling of different nutrients in the ecosystem like nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur and so on. Because of all the changes that is happening in the ecosystem and this diversity, the biodiversity, the species and so on, there is lot of changes that is occurring even in the kind of cycling of the nutrients that is happening in an ecosystem. So, that is what we are going to look at now. So, since 1960, flows of biologically available nitrogen in the terrestrial ecosystems has doubled and flows of phosphorus has tripled, and more than 50% of all the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer ever used has been used since 1985. And 60% of the increase in atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide since 1750 has taken place since 1959. So, human produced reactive nitrogen is what is mentioned here. Here humans are produce as much biologically available nitrogen as all the natural pathways, and this grows further 65% by the year 2050, which has been predicted. So this graph actually represents the the tetragrams of nitrogen per year as an example. So here you look at the range of terrestrial bacterial nitrogen fixation in the except in the agroecosystems. Now there is this line, this dark gray color line looks at the projected human input, how much humans input is there in this nitrogen, and then you have the brown line which shows the fertilizer and industrial uses, then nitrogen fixing in agroecosystems by the nitrogen fixation bacteria, and the purple line shows the fossil fuels. So between 1900 and 2000, and of course now it has been predicted up to 2050, there is going to be an increase in this human output of nitrogen. So significant and largely irreversible change that is going to happen to species diversity is the distribution of species on the earth is becoming more homogeneous rather than heterogeneous, and humans have increased species extinction rate by 50 and 1000 times over the background rates typical over the Earth's planet history. And 10 to 30% of mammal, bird and amphibian species are currently threatened with extinction from medium to high certainty. So this picture here is looking at the source is again the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and extinctions that are happening per million species per year. Okay, so that is represented in the y-axis. On the x-axis you have the marine species, mammals of the fossil record, then past century, what has happened to these mammals, birds and amphibians, and for all the species put together, there is a model done up to the year 2050 as to what will be the future projections for these changes. So we find that there is a lot of loss in the marine species, mammals. So this is the kinds of extinctions that has happened. If you look at say past century, more than 10 million extinctions per year for mammals, amphibians, and birds slightly less than 10 million species. Okay, so now we move to the next finding, which talks about gains and losses from ecosystem change and the three major problems, that is your degradation of ecosystem service, increased likelihood of non-linear changes, and exacerbation of poverty for some people. So the finding number 2, this states that there are changes that have been made to ecosystems that have contributed to substantial net gains in the human well-being and economic development, but these gains have been achieved at the growing cost. See, what exactly it means is that actually all these kinds of changes have contributed to a lot of growth, a lot of economic development and so on, and human well-being has kind of shown an increased trend, but it is at the cost of loss of biodiversity. So we are extracting so much and we are trying to gain, but in the long run the biodiversity which is supporting all our services, they are getting spoiled. So therefore the scope for these availability of these biodiversity and resources for the other generations is also under threat. So this is why it says that though there have been net gains in human well-being and economic development, it shows it is being achieved at a growing cost. Growing cost in the sense we are utilizing so much of the biodiversity, so there is a environmental cost which is very high, and these problems will substantially diminish the benefits the future generations obtain from the ecosystems, which I just mentioned now. And changes to ecosystems have provided substantial benefits. So we continue with that, saying that since 1960, while population doubled and economic activities has increased 6-fold, what are all the benefits that we derived as food production? There has been increased food production, that is 2.5 times more, and food production per capita actually has grown and the food price fell down. But actually this is now rising and we will talk about these factors at the later stage. And water use doubled, wood harvest for pulp and paper production has tripled, timber production increased by more than half, and installed hydropower capacity also doubled. So this is the graph which is showing you this. This dark brown line, this is the total food production, whereas if you look at food production per capita, the dotted dark brown line is slightly below that. And the oil crisis, what is happening to the oil, okay? Then you have this blue line which is showing the undernourished in the developing countries. In spite of the food production, you find that there is such a high instance of undernourished population in the developing countries. So this is undernourished in millions in million persons, and this is the index that is showing this since 1961 to about 2003. And what is happening to the food price? The food price is slightly reduced because of the increased production, but then the food availability is a problem. And degradation and unsustainable use of ecosystem services. So approximately 60%, that is 15 out of 24 of the ecosystem services evaluated in the assessment are being degraded, are used unsustainably. And the degradation of ecosystem services often causes significant harm to human well-being and represents a loss of natural asset or wealth of a country. See here, this kind of degradation is so much on the increase that now we find this assessment has now put forth that all the resources or the biodiversity are used unsustainably. The extraction is unsustainable. The mode of the development is development and other human activities are all becoming unsustainable. So therefore, there is this is going to hamper the natural capital or the biodiversity, and therefore it is also going to hit hard on the human population if we do not take any measures now. So status of provisioning services. When we look at this, we find that there is food, crops, livestock, capture fisheries, aquaculture, wild foods and so on. What is the kind of status? It is slightly up, like it is, the trend is showing the status as a slightly moderate, and there is lot of dwindling in the fisheries which is coming down. And fiber like timber, cotton, silk, you have both positive and negative impacts. Genetic resources at large, they are all coming down and declining. Similarly, this shows status of regulating and cultural services for many other services. For instance, pollination. The pollinator population are declining so much, and it is going to actually have an impact on the many of the natural species that are dependent on the population of the pollinators. So cultural services, here we look at spiritual and religious values and so on. These are all going down. Okay, now degradation of ecosystem services often changes or causes the significant harm to human well-being. We continue with this points under this topic, saying that the total economic value that is associated with the managed ecosystems, they are more substantially often high than the value that is associated with the conversion. So conversion often still takes place because private economic benefits are often greater for the converted system. See, now if you leave the agricultural crops as it is and maintain it in the pristine condition, or if you take up a patch of forest and keep it in a pristine condition, it is of high biodiversity value. But we are not if we convert this forest into a agricultural land for other kinds of productivity or some kind of industries, that will the economic gains will be much more. It will outweigh the environmental benefits. Where you find a situation where there is increase in the economics, whereas decrease in the environmental factors. So it will be at the cost of cutting the forest or at the cost of taking away the agricultural lands and using it and diverting it for other land use purposes. Okay, so now we look at this graph which shows the difference between sustainable managed ecosystems and the converted ecosystems. What is the kind of impact in different areas? For instance, wetlands in Canada, tropical forest in Cameroon, mangroves ecosystems in Thailand, and tropical forest in Cambodia. So here you have intact wetland versus the intensive farming. So this converted, you find that this is unsustainable because you are converting most of the wetlands. And here in the forestry, you are converting the forest lands for small scale farming. And in this case, in the mangroves, you are diverting it for shrimp farming, which is an over exploitation, though there are economic gains. So this is the kind of trend which has been captured by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And here you look at the degradation of ecosystem services, that is representing a loss of capital asset. So number one will be loss of wealth due to ecosystem degradation. This is not reflected in the economic accounts. So therefore, ecosystem services as well as resources such as mineral deposits, soil nutrients, fossil fuels are all capital assets. And traditional national accounts, they do not include the measures of resource depletion or of degradation of these resources. See, like when you come to look at the resources and economics and so on, it is very important to do what is known as the natural resource accounting, where we kind of look into the different accounts of the different resources that are existing in a place. And we also look at how do we balance the positives and the negatives, and look at whether the economic, what are, like you have these three factors of sustainability, which is economic, environmental and social. So whether there is an equal benefits for all these dimensions of sustainability or only one. So that is what is the actual accounting, natural resource accounting. So if we enter into a developmental activity like making setting up an industry, there will be economic gain. But the country can project that this industry has contributed to so much of input, because the production from the industry has got lot of inputs. So this has actually led to the decline in the actual natural resources or biodiversity. So nobody accounts for the loss that has happened in the biodiversity. So to summarize quickly, what we have looked at is many natural events, okay, and also more so the human induced activities are leading to loss of biodiversity. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is actually a global initiative, which as I have talked to you about, and this is important because it is trying to look at the important aspects of biodiversity and decisions in the different countries to address the biodiversity loss. And the findings 1 and 2 of the MEA actually shows changes that have occurred over the past 5 decades, biodiversity loss and impacts on the various ecosystem services. So the questions related to this topic are: give reasons to justify the conservation of biodiversity, list some of the major issues relating to biodiversity, what is Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, what are the Millennium Ecosystem Findings 1, and what are the Millennium Ecosystem Findings 2. Thank you. So we will close this particular topic now, and we will continue with the Millennium Ecosystem findings because there are 3 and 4 findings, and part of also 2 which we need to cover in the next set of lectures. Thank you.